"Don't come near her." These were the first words of the man holding the Kalashnikov rifle. He blocked my mother from moving any closer. I wanted to shout, but my scarf felt like a noose tightening around my throat. Through a veil of frustrated tears, I watched the two men standing over the woman on the ground. She was having a seizure. "She's going to die," my mother pleaded, beads of sweat appearing on her upper lip. "Then let her die," the man in fatigue said. The acrid silence that hung in the air was soon replaced with the cries of a newborn kitten. Our cat, who had just given birth in our basement, the night before I had watched her lick each kitten methodically before even considering the bowl of milk that I had placed next to her. Now, this wasn't a scene from a jacked up high school play or a war story from a faraway land. This was my front yard after a birthday party. A birthday party! The woman shaking on the ground was our neighbor, who was terminally ill with lymphoma. She had gathered all her strength to throw her 16-year-old an illegal birthday party. It was illegal because it allowed the guests the luxury to imagine that they were free to do as they pleased. See, a few years before that, in my country, my parents and other grown-ups had decided that their government wasn't working for them. They were tired of their country being weak. They wanted independence from foreign oil companies, and they wanted God to guide their laws. Like a sick kid who knows much too much about procedures and tests, at age 11, I knew much too much about the new laws that prevented me from having a proper childhood. I knew that my people had put an outsider in charge of the country. The man in charge had promised us freedom and jobs. He had promised to end corruption. We didn't know that this revolt against establishment was going to set us back 1,400 years. Imagine, it started with a murmur of worry, a tiny fracture in our boundless optimism. Whispers surfaced that opposing views would not be tolerated by the new government. Surely that was paranoid nonsense, we thought. But before we could remember our former civil rights, journalists were arrested, newspapers were shut down, and people of a certain religion were targeted. Women's rights were cut in half. And just like that, half the population became second-class citizens. When women took to the streets to protest, they were tear gassed, hit over the head, and with batons and jailed. The men who stood up by those women were also hit, maybe even more severely, and jailed. In a corner, Margaret Atwood stood silently and took notes for her Handmaid's Tale. When we were in the throes of a war and were getting killed by the thousands every day, it occurred to us that this change wasn't making Iran great by any stretch. Earlier that night, I had sat in the corner of my neighbor's house watching people who had momentarily left their woes behind. Each guest, including myself, had lost multiple people to war and political persecution. But they were now busy laughing and dancing. Of course, they had taken the proper precautions. The shades were drawn, and the music wasn't too loud. Even so, I couldn't enjoy myself. A bad feeling was burning in my stomach, pinning me to the chair. While girls on the other side of the world bragged about their latest piercings, I was sporting an impressive hole in my stomach that kept me up at night. This physician diagnosed ulcer didn't afford me any bragging rights, but it dutifully warned me of all the things that could get us into trouble. Unrelated men and women in the same room, a vodka bottle, dancing, music. Even though I had forgotten what freedom felt like, I often visited the fantasy that maybe nature would take care of a bad situation. Last night, my cat disposed of a deformed kitten in the litter by eating it. So maybe an invisible mother cat would eat this erratic, deformed monster of a government. My parents warned me not to share these thoughts with my friends, as disagreements between family and friends had become weaponized, and spies were everywhere. Dissidents were labeled as terrorists and executed. Each and every time, security trumped freedom. With our ideals and dreams dead and buried and an actual war raging, we could feel death's cold kiss on our necks. We developed strange superstitions. For instance, my mother, who would never throw a party herself, could seldom resist an invitation to one. Mine was to never stop worrying. It had worked thus far. Just then, someone in the front yard screamed, "Men in fatigues!" Men in fatigues. 3 dreaded words. A disturbing wave of panic spread to the whole house. Now everyone's belly felt like mine. It is quite remarkable what the human body can do under stress. Like trained athletes, the guests, including old women, jumped into our yard, jumped the wall into our yard, their feet bare, some limping badly from a bad landing. They ran to the street. Some caught cabs. Others walked home, trying their best to look inconspicuous. As one would expect, our neighbor's cancer was not her ally during the raid. She was the last one to come over the wall, and by that time, 2 men in fatigues had caught up. "Please, she is sick," my mother pleaded. "So?" said the short one, as the other turned his rifle towards us. "We need to search your house," he said, a grimace revealing his yellow teeth. My mother gestured with her open hand towards the house, but even I could feel her heartbeat. The summer before, I had witnessed a wild dog sink his teeth into the back of a kitten, shaking the little guy furiously. I wanted to free the poor thing, but every time I stepped forward, the dog growled and shook the kitten even harder until its body went limp. When the quiet guard wouldn't help us help my neighbor, I felt the same bitter bile of helplessness in my throat. "Let's go," said the short one. "And if you have bottles of alcohol, chess sets, playing cards, or contraband literature, you will be ripped, jailed, and who knows what else." His agitated words, like bullets of a machine gun, sprayed over the yard. It was as if he had grown weary of giving the same speech for the 1,000th time to unruly children who were intent on defying him. He motioned with his gun for us to move. Although we were dying to do so, my mother and I didn't look back at the woman on the ground. Instead, holding each other's sweaty hands, we watched the men in fatigues tear up our house. We had some playing cards in the basement. They were useful. We often played spades by candlelight during air raids. They kept us distracted from the bombings. My mother and I held our breaths as the men approached the basement, but our cat, brimming with vigilant mama instincts, hissed at them, and they turned away distracted. I buried my head in my mom's chest, muffling my sobs of relief. I could feel my mom's warm breath on my ear as she whispered, "The cat saved us." The short one, disappointed that he hadn't found anything juicy, asked why we were harboring fugitives. "We did no such thing," my mother explained. "All of a sudden, people jumped over the wall into my house and onto the streets. What was I supposed to do?" She mustered her most indignant voice. And then she pointed to our neighbor, who was now lying motionless under the willow tree, and said, "She is innocent." Our neighbor survived that night, but died shortly after. Instead of talking about it, my mother and I went about our lives. This was our new normal. Lifetimes later, after the election, I called my mother. She's now in her 80s, but like me, she can feel the change in the air. Her bright voice ripples with a wave of concern. "Will the cat save us this time?"